The sun burned white against the endless sky, so fierce it made the wooden planks of the town's main street shimmer. Dust rose with each step, clinging to skirts and boots alike, settling in every crease of clothing and skin. At the center of it all, nailed to the rough boards of the general store's notice wall, hung a single sheet of paper, edges curled by the wind. Ranch cook wanted, apply at noon. Meals provided, fair wage. The handwriting was firm, square, and blunt, much like the man who had written it. Clara Matthews stood a few paces away, her hand resting on the narrow shoulder of her son Thomas. She had read the words once, then again, and a third time, as though each glance might steady the tremble inside her chest. Her daughter Emily clung to her other side, clutching a ragged doll whose stitched smile had faded but whose presence gave her comfort. Clara's lips were dry, her bonnet frayed at the edges, and her dress bore the marks of long travel. Yet her eyes, blue and tired though they were, still held something unbroken. They had come to this town 2 days earlier on a freight wagon bound west. The driver had given her a kind price, but once they'd arrived, his wheels had rolled on without hesitation, leaving her and her children with only their trunk, a small pouch of coins, and no clear place to go. She had spent those 2 days searching, asking after work, after shelter, after hope. Each time, the answer had been a shake of the head or a sympathetic glance. Widows were not uncommon, but a widow with 2 young mouths to feed was a burden many weren't willing to shoulder. Still, she had not given up. Giving up meant hunger for Thomas and Emily, meant cold nights and empty bellies. And she would not, let that happen. When Thomas tugged her skirt and pointed toward the notice, her heart had skipped. She leaned forward, lips moving silently as she read. A cook. She could do that. She had fed her husband, rest his soul, after long days working the land. She had learned to stretch beans and flour into hearty meals, had baked bread even when there was little to bake it with, had seasoned simple food with patience and care. Perhaps it would be enough. Do you think we'll get it, Mama? Thomas asked, his voice thin but filled with hope. He had his father's eyes, steady and dark, though they were far too serious for an 8-year-old. Clara smoothed his hair, though dust already clung to it again. We'll try, sweetheart, she whispered, her gaze still fixed on the notice. That's all we can do. The town's clock struck noon, its clang echoing down the street, startling Emily, who pressed her doll tighter against her chest. Clara drew both children close as a tall man rode into view, the clop of his bay horse's hooves scattering dust. He was a striking figure, though not in the way of polished men. His shirt was worn, patched at the elbow, tucked neatly into work trousers. His broad shoulders carried the weight of someone used to labor. The brim of his hat shaded his face, but as he reined in the horse and dismounted, Clara caught the lines carved by sun and sorrow. Luke McAllister. She did not know his name yet, but the townsfolk did. A rancher who kept to himself, who worked harder than most but rarely spoke more than necessary. They said he had lost too much too soon, parents taken before their time, siblings scattered, and the heavy responsibility of a ranch left squarely on his back. He was known for fairness but not for warmth, for strength but not for softness. He tied his horse to the post and scanned the small knot of people gathered around the notice. A few men had come out of curiosity, but one glance at the word, cook, had sent most drifting away, uninterested in kitchen work. A couple of women lingered, but when they caught sight of Clara's children at her skirts, they whispered to each other and turned back toward the saloon or their own homes. Soon, only Clara remained, standing straight though her hands fidgeted in her apron. Luke's gaze met hers. You're here about the notice? His voice was even, low, carrying a quiet authority. Yes, Clara answered, swallowing the lump in her throat. I can cook. I can make bread, stew, beans, meals that fill a man's stomach. I'll keep your kitchen in order, and my children, she hesitated only a heartbeat. My children will help where they can. Luke's eyes shifted to the boy first. Thomas met his gaze with a seriousness beyond his years, chin lifted, as though silently promising he wouldn't be a burden. Then to the girl, who clung to her doll but didn't cry. Luke's jaw tightened. He hadn't planned for children. He wanted someone to fry bacon and brew coffee, not a family. Yet something in the woman's voice, firm, but touched with desperation, stirred a part of him he thought long buried. "Ranch work is long and rough," he said, crossing his arms. "You'll be up before dawn. Meals for the hands, 3 times a day. Pays fair, but it won't make you rich." "I'm not looking for riches," Clara said quickly. Her hands were trembling, but her voice didn't waver. "I'm looking for a chance. Just a chance to work and keep my children fed." For a long moment, silence stretched between them, filled only by the restless stamping of the bay horse and the whisper of wind across the street. Luke studied her, his eyes narrowing slightly, as though weighing not just her words but the grit behind them. He thought of the ranch house, empty except for his own footsteps. He thought of meals eaten alone, of mornings that began in silence and ended the same. He thought of the burden of work that never lightened, no matter how many days he gave to it. Finally, he gave a short nod. "All right, pack your things. You start today." Clara's breath left her in a rush, so sudden it nearly stole her balance. She gathered her children close, pressing a trembling hand to Emily's hair. Relief washed over her, mingling with gratitude so fierce it stung her eyes. Luke turned back to his horse, preparing to ride out, but something in the woman's quiet thank you followed him, settling in his chest like an ember. He hadn't wanted a family. He hadn't asked for one. But perhaps, in hiring a cook, he had opened the door to more than he realized. And as Clara led her children to gather their small belongings, she, too, did not yet know that this decision would shape not just their survival, but their hearts, binding the lives of a weary widow and a lonely rancher in ways neither had expected when they first stood before that notice at noon. The first morning on the McAllister ranch began in darkness. Clara rose before the rooster crowed, striking a match and coaxing the cook stove to life. The kitchen smelled faintly of wood smoke and old grease, but as the fire grew, so did her determination. She rolled up her sleeves, pulling flour from a sack, kneading dough until her arms ached, setting it aside to rise while she stirred beans and chopped onions. Her hands moved with the practiced rhythm of a woman who had lived years by necessity. Emily slept curled on a pallet near the stove, while Thomas rubbed his eyes and tried to carry firewood inside, insisting he was strong enough. Clara thanked him with a kiss to his forehead, though she took most of the weight from his small arms. By sunrise, the ranch hands shuffled into the kitchen, some yawning, others already grumbling about the work ahead. They eyed Clara curiously, unused to a woman at the stove, but when the smell of biscuits filled the room, suspicion gave way to hunger. Luke entered last, his presence filling the doorway. He didn't speak at first, only tipped his hat slightly in her direction before sitting at the head of the table. Clara set plates before them, moving quickly between stove and table, her heart racing as she waited for some sign of approval. The men dug in, forks scraped against tin plates, low voices murmured words like, "good," and, "not bad at all." One of the older hands asked for another biscuit, and soon the plates were cleared. It wasn't lavish, but it was hearty, and no one left hungry. Clara exhaled, relief flooding her as though she had passed her first unspoken test. Life on the ranch settled into rhythm, though each day brought exhaustion. Clara woke before dawn, cooked 3 meals, scrubbed pans until her knuckles cracked, and still found time to mend torn shirts or sweep the wooden floors. The children did their best to help. Thomas followed the ranch hands like a shadow, carrying buckets of water or sweeping the porch. Emily gathered wildflowers from the fields and placed them in jars on the table, brightening the dim house with color. Little by little, the place that had once echoed with emptiness began to carry the sounds of life. Luke noticed. He told himself he didn't care. His only concern was that the men were fed and the work went on, but he found himself listening for the children's laughter in the yard, for Clara's quiet hum as she kneaded dough. He had lived too long with silence. He had thought it a companion, but now he realized it had been a weight pressing him down. Still, he kept his distance. He wasn't a man who knew how to speak easily, and he wasn't sure what to do with the stirrings of warmth he felt when he saw Thomas proudly show his mother the splinter he'd pulled from a fence rail, or when Emily pressed a daisy into his rough palm, smiling up at him as though he were some hero. He wasn't a hero. He was a man with calloused hands and a heart too battered by loss. One evening, the sky darkened with storm clouds rolling fast over the plains. The wind picked up, howling against the barn walls. Luke and the men rushed to secure the cattle, shouting over the thunder. Thomas had followed, wanting to prove himself useful, but the storm was fierce. As Luke wrestled a gate into place, he caught sight of the boy struggling with a loose board. A sudden gust tore it free, knocking Thomas hard to the ground. Clara's cry rang out as she ran from the porch, but Luke was already there, scooping the boy into his arms. Inside the house, with rain hammering the windows, Luke laid Thomas on the table and examined his arm. His hands were steady, practiced from years of tending injured animals, and he worked gently, binding the bruised limb with cloth. Clara hovered, her face pale with fear, her hand gripping Emily's shoulder. "He'll be all right," Luke said at last, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "No break, just sore. He's tough." Clara's knees nearly buckled with relief. She brushed Thomas's hair back, whispering words of comfort, then lifted her eyes to Luke. For the first time, she saw not just the rancher who had hired her but the man beneath the stoic mask, a man who carried concern quietly, who knew how to steady others even when storms raged. That night, after the children had drifted to sleep on their pallet by the fire, Clara lingered in the kitchen, the storm outside reduced to a distant rumble. Luke sat across from her, elbows resting on his knees, staring into the flames. Neither spoke at first. The silence was no longer heavy, but tentative, as though waiting for one of them to shape it into something new. "You didn't have to give us this chance," Clara said at last, her voice low. "Most men would have turned me away." Luke lifted his gaze, the firelight flickering in his eyes. "Maybe I needed it as much as you did." Her throat tightened. She hadn't expected honesty, but there it was, plain and unadorned. She nodded slowly, fingers twisting in her lap. They sat together like that, two souls who had lost much, yet for the first time in years, neither of them felt quite so alone. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months. The ranch remained hard work, but it no longer felt lifeless. Luke found himself lingering at the breakfast table, listening as Thomas described his latest attempt to ride bareback or as Emily chattered about the wildflowers she'd discovered. Clara's laughter, soft, rare at first, began to surface more often, weaving through the house like sunlight breaking through clouds. She still carried guilt, still prayed each night for strength, but the edges of her sorrow began to dull. The children, once thin and weary, grew stronger, their cheeks flushed with health. They ran freely across the fields, their voices carrying on the wind. And Luke, though he would not admit it aloud, felt something shift inside him every time he saw them racing across the grass, their mother smiling in the doorway. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Clara stood on the porch watching the children chase each other. Luke stepped up beside her, silent for a while, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "They've grown," he said quietly. Clara nodded. "Yes, stronger than I ever hoped." She glanced at him, her eyes reflecting the sunset. "They wouldn't have had that chance without you." Luke's jaw tightened, but his voice was gentle. "Without you, Clara, this place would have stayed nothing but work and dust." For a long moment, they simply stood together, the sounds of children's laughter blending with the whisper of the evening breeze. Neither spoke of what was blooming between them, but both felt it, an unspoken bond, fragile yet real, built not on riches or promises, but on shared burdens, quiet kindness, and the slow weaving of lives once broken into something whole again.